Guys, check it out. My orchid cactus is in bloom. How beautiful, how fragrant. I love these plants. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to discuss what is an orchid cactus, how do we grow them in environments where we in locations with cold winters, such as where I live in eastern Pennsylvania. A little bit of history of orchid cactus, and we'll also touch on propagation as well. Let's see, can I get this guy down? Oh, this is heavy. Oh. Wow guys, let's just take a moment and enjoy some of this beauty. Look at these flowers, these are incredible. There's so many flower buds growing all over this plant. This is an incredible display of blooms, the best display of blooms that I've ever had on my orchid cactus. And so, what is an orchid cactus? Orchid cactus is kind of a generic term to refer to plants from the genus Epiphyllum Disocactus, Selenicereus, and a couple other smaller genus out there. And the plants that comprise this term, orchid cactus, are epiphytic plants that typically hail from the areas of Mexico, Central America, regions of South America in the rainforest. Now these, as epiphytic plants in the rainforest, these will actually be found growing kind of in like the pockets of your tree branches and like kind of like between the trunk and branches in those areas. Sort of like a bromeliad, actually very much like a bromeliad. And in those locations, these plants grow natively and wildly. Orchid cactus, we use that term to refer to them because over the last 100 years or so, there have been so many genetic hybrids that have taken place, crosses between, intergeneric crosses between Epiphyllum and Disocactus, between Epiphyllum Selenicereus. So a lot of times it can be very difficult to distinguish exactly what kind of orchid cactus you have. And for that reason, I wanted to create a video that's kind of a generic orchid cactus video. What are some of the main tips for creating the maximum growth of your orchid cactus, as well as tips for encouraging your plant to produce flower buds? Now, all that I'm going to be saying can be applied to any kind of orchid cactus. That being said, some of what I may be saying may not apply to your specific orchid cactus, but none of what I'm saying will create any harm or be any sort of adverse cultural recommendation for your plant. So just rest assured, if you follow my growing tips that I'm going to be talking about in this video, you will have success with your orchid cactus, and I can pretty safely say you will get them to flower. All right, so let's follow along. My history with orchid cactus is pretty long and varied. I've grown tons of different orchid cactus. Perhaps you saw my video of the Queen of the Night orchid cactus that I had blooming over the summertime with some incredible white, beautiful blooms, so fragrant. You can see how that plant looked while it was in bloom. Now, with this plant right here next to me, I've actually planted two different kinds of orchid cactus into one pot. One variety, which is blooming right now, is the Disocactus macranthus. It produces these beautiful, fragrant, golden flowers that look reminiscent of an orchid. You know, that's why we call them orchid cactus, because the flowers are so brilliant, they're so beautiful, so rich in color, they're reminiscent of an orchid, so that's kind of where they get the term, the orchid part of the equation. Now, I also have another plant blooming in here, which is, I believe, Epiphyllum George French. Now you can see the blooms on this plant I had blooming over the summer a few months ago. Right now I'm into autumn here, it's almost November. And the reason that I planted those two different opposing kinds of orchid cactus into one pot was simply because the Epiphyllum George French blooms in the summertime, and then my Disocactus macranthus blooms kind of in the fall and then in the springtime. So I wanted to really encourage, you know, the maximum amount of bloom flower power in my container. So now we know why they have the part orchid in it. They're also, they are genetically a cactus. They're succulent plants, and rather than having foliage, that we would think of like normal leaves, what these are actually flattened stems. And for that reason, sometimes you will find that your stems, sometimes they're rounded, sometimes they're kind of triangular in shape, sometimes they're totally flat, and then they have sort of other sections that are not totally flat. So there's a lot of variation amongst the leaves or the flattened stems on the orchid cactus. So never be worried about that if you have some that are just like super long shoots that are totally round for the entire length of that stem versus other ones that are totally flat. It's just normal natural genetic variation. So when I was living in Colombia, I had the opportunity of seeing some beautiful plants that were 100% outdoor grown plants, some even growing right in the ground. And you can see from these images that those plants, when they're grown outside, that's really when they reach their maximum potential. So it's definitely something that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about when we are growing our orchid cactus. Now, another orchid cactus you might be familiar with is the rickrack cactus like this. You can see beautiful, you can see the foliage is very similar, but it's called the rickrack because it just racks back and forth. Sometimes called the fishbone cactus, which I really love. And there's two different kinds of rickrack cactus. There's a Selenicereus anthocyanus, and then the Epiphyllum anguliger, which without having flowers, it can be almost impossible to tell which one is which, but they are distinguished by their flowers, in particular the flower color. Here you can see the Epiphyllum anguliger rickrack cactus in bloom, and it is stunning with those white and golden flowers. Okay, so on to the cultural care requirements to make our orchid cactus happy and bloom like this. First of all, like I was mentioning, these really need to be grown outside in the summertime while your weather is warm. If you really want to get flowers on your plant, they need to be outside, and they need to be outside as long as those night temperatures are above 45 degrees. Now, succulents, unlike some other tropical plants like aroids, like things like philodendrons and monsteras, these can actually handle cooler temperatures. Honestly, they could take all the way down to 35, 40 degrees. But I typically leave mine outside as long as the temperatures are above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is super important, and we'll talk about why that's so important here in a minute. So now, while they're outside, the very best sort of sun location for these plants is the location that is going to give them morning sunlight for about 1 or 2 hours. You could do afternoon sunlight, but I find here in eastern Pennsylvania that the sun in the afternoon can be a little bit hot and intense. That's why I try to give mine about 1 or 2 hours in the morning, no more. As a rainforest dweller, these are underneath the canopy of trees. They very rarely get sustained long periods of pure, intense, direct sunlight. Too much sun, they're going to get stressed out, and the plants will look stressed out. And that's a bad kind of stress that could prohibit them from blooming. It's definitely going to, can definitely lead to burnt foliage and just a very unhappy plant. So early morning sunlight is the ideal. Now, while they're outside in the summertime, remember, they're from the rainforest. They get rain pretty much like all the time, every day. But growing as an epiphyte in the pocket of those trees, you'll note a couple of things. They get rainfall frequently, so we like to keep our plants quite nice and moist in the summertime while they're outside. They need that even moisture for a nice, even, explosive growth. As an epiphyte, they need very sharp draining soil. So you could even do a 50-50 combination of perlite and potting soil, and that's going to provide a very nice porous substrate for your plant's roots. The plant's roots will not get overladen with water. They will have a nice chance to drain very rapidly, and that's going to help it create the nice environment that these guys need in order to thrive, all right? Now, once we bring them back inside our homes in the fall time, for the fall and winter time, it is important that we actually restrict our water in the wintertime. So we give it nice water in the summertime, but then we restrict water in the wintertime. I actually will water mine about once a month or even once every 6 weeks. Now the reason is because if we remember from some of our other succulents, our other cactus, that it's almost impossible to provide sufficient light for even growth of our succulents and cactus during those cold winter months. So what happens is if we give it water without sufficient light, it's gonna try to grow, and it will grow. But that growth is going to be uneven. Oftentimes it's going to be weak, spindly, and what you will find is that it's going to have leaves that get very floppy rather than having any sort of upright structure about them. And we don't want a very, they're already trailing in nature, so we want to have them with the strongest foliage possible. So that's why we're going to restrict our water. In terms of lighting, like you saw up on my shelf, I have it under a grow light. So I keep it under a grow light all winter long, and that gives it some good, and that gives it kind of the appropriate amount of lighting. Otherwise, a nice bright sunny window is ideal. West exposure, southern exposure for all of my friends here in the northern hemisphere. Now also, in terms of fertilization, during those summer months when it's actively growing, I fertilize it. I use my family's brand, Roberta's Bounty fertilizer, about once every 2 to 3 weeks during those active growing periods in the summertime with lots of water. In the wintertime, restricting that water has less light. I'm also not fertilizing at all. Okay, so let's talk about flowers. That's what we all want. We want to get those flowers. So now that we have a good idea of what kind of conditions they need in order to thrive and to grow, how do we induce our plants to produce beautiful buds and flowers like we're seeing right now? So the way to encourage our plants to produce those flowers, like I was saying, we need to leave them outside in the summertime until the temperatures start to dip to about 45 degrees. Why do I make such a big point of that? These plants actually need a pretty long period of weather where the day and night temperatures have a differential of about 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 to 8 weeks where the day temperatures are about 10 to 20 degrees above where they are at night. So you can imagine in the middle of summertime, the days get up to 90 and then the nights get down to 70. That's what I mean by that differential. Now, they need that long period in order to initiate that bud formation. So once they've had that long period, that's gonna actually encourage that plant to start to produce those buds. So for me, with this Disocactus, this is a plant that's gonna produce those flower buds in fall and in spring after having those night and day differentials. So that day and night differential is by far the most important aspect to consider when trying to encourage our orchid cactus to bloom. Another thing that I have found is very important in terms of the timing of when our blooms occur is a lot of the different orchid cactus will really respond when the days and nights are about equal in terms of the amount of daylight. So I find that very few will bloom in the middle of summer when the days are very long and the nights are very short. And I also find that they are very rarely going to be blooming in the middle of winter when the days are really short and the nights are really long. Having those different periods where they have sun and then a good chunk of night and back and forth, that is also going to help encourage our plants to bloom. We call that photoperiodism, and that is very similar to what our Christmas cactus, Thanksgiving cactus, Easter cactus need in order for these guys to bloom. They need a specific amount of night time without any lights in order to encourage the flowers to form. So that's another aspect that we can consider when encouraging our orchid cactus to bloom, is thinking about how we get our Christmas cactus to bloom. Those day and night, those periods of day and night time, so important. And so while we're growing our orchid cactus, the other thing that we want to consider is the size of our container. These absolutely like to be pot bound. You can see the size of this plant for the size of this container. Definitely a small container. This plant is exploding out of that pot size. That helps to recreate that epiphytic feeling of root boundedness that it has in those tree limbs. And that also encourages a nice amount of stress to the plant to create nice growth and flowers. And the last thing to note about flower formation is that some of the plants that will bloom in that late fall, early winter, in that transition period like I was talking about, they will create their flower buds after they have had an opportunity to dry out, because that creates a nice amount of stress, a healthy stress that encourages flower formation. So that's another reason why we want to really keep our plants nice and dry during that winter. So you can clearly see I love my orchid cactus. I have another rickrack here. Now this is the Selenicereus, and then I have my Epiphyllum Disocactus, which is the queen of the night. And this plant is so big, I take cuttings of it for propagation all the time. So let's see how we do a nice propagation. So when you're propagating, you want to find a nice piece that is at least 6 to 8 inches long. And this guy is like a foot long, so this is perfect. Now you can see where it kind of emanates from this other stem foliage. So I like to cut mine just where it is adhering to that other leaf. Just like that. Now you can see these little notches here are the important thing to note. You can see notch here, notch here, notch here. We want to get at least 3 of those under the soil when we are planting these up. Now after you've taken your cutting, you really want to give it an opportunity to callus over for about almost a week. That really just allows the place where you cut it to kind of heal, to cure over, and that's going to keep it from rotting or getting any sort of infection or anything like that. So we let it cure over for about a week, and then we're ready to plant it. So this is the guy I just cut, but I had this guy that I cut off about a week ago in preparation for this video. So I have a nice mixture of soil in here. It's a very nice, well-draining mix of perlite and potting mix. And so then I just take my cutting and I simply place it down till the base of that cutting is basically at the bottom of the pot. And that's it. I'm not even going to water it, not yet. We're gonna let it sit for another couple weeks, and then we'll revisit it, take a look at it, see if we see any growth. And at that point, we can rest assured that it's safe to give it a nice water. Now, alternatively, if you are using a heat pad, like I have right here, you can absolutely water it now and place it on your heat pad, and that's going to encourage a nice root formation very quickly. I always recommend using a heat pad when we're starting our propagations because that bottom heat is what will induce those roots to form out of your cutting so that you have a successful cutting that roots very, very quickly. But we're not going to use the heating pad this time. We're just going to go place it over in a sunny window. All right, guys, so now you know exactly how to grow your orchid cactus, what sort of cultural requirements, cultural care you should be giving your cactus if you want to see beautiful blooms like I have on mine. It's not hard, they're very easy, they're very rewarding plants, they're beautiful, and they propagate like a cinch. So definitely consider starting one of your own, spreading and sharing it with other plant lovers in your life. So if you guys have any further comments, definitely leave a comment below. I always try to do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my page if you haven't subscribed yet, and definitely think about sharing it with someone else in your life that might enjoy this video. Anyways, thank you guys for catching me here on Plant Vibrations. I'll catch you soon. Ciao.